Hey everybody, Nick here, and today I want to have a little bit more of a discussion with you about the idea of a backup beta sort of knife. And first off, I want to say I want to thank my buddy Jim for lending these guys along, as well as for the discussion that led to the idea of this whole video here. Been thinking about it a little bit, but he said some nice things that kind of crystallized things. And but anyways, the big question here is, why do you buy a pocket knife? There are two main reasons I see. I'm sure there were more, but still. On the one hand, it's to cut things. You want a little device that you keep in your pocket that has a sharpened edge that can separate materials cleanly. That is an important thing. It is a useful tool in your everyday life. And in fact, for folks who don't carry a pocket knife, very often you're not aware of how useful it can be, because every time you need to cut something, you're using the wrong tool for the job. You try to pop over. Anyways, I digress. So one reason you would buy a knife is to cut things. But the other reason that some of us, particularly I think people watching this channel and jackasses like me, love a pocket knife for the art, for the mastery, because the object itself is beautiful. There are knives like this guy, the We Knives Eschaton, which are really fundamentally designed to be appreciated as pieces of industrial design art. Yeah, they cut things, but that's not the goal. And there are knives that actually do both, like this Alamic Swish here. This is a perfectly capable cutting tool, but it also happens to be beautifully hand engraved with, oh man, do I like this freaking object here. And so, you know, those are the two main reasons. And some folks only care about the cutting tool side of things. We call these people the sane ones. They pick up knives like this, they use them, they cut with them, they put them back in their pocket, they carry it until it dies, and then they replace it. But there are many folks who want both that mastery and the functionality, and this results in a category of things that is sort of the nice knife. Knives that are very good, but also reasonably functional. Or, going a step further, you get into things that become closer to pocket jewelry. Things, you know, that you carry, you can cut with them 100%, but that's not what they're really designed for. And because at some level, it is more efficient to have a nice tool that cuts things, which is also awesome. It's 2-in-1. And having that requirement that it be a functional cutting tool is, in some ways, nice for purchases. For me, I try not to buy knives that are completely non-functional, that just don't work well as pocket tools. But for many people, this works, just to have one tool that does both of those things. But the problem is, there are many situations in the world where a nice knife, no matter what it looks like, is not the tool for the job. Imagine that you've got like a cardboard template that you need to cut out on the concrete floor of a warehouse. You absolutely could use a fancy, you know, everyday carry knife kind of piece like this guy. You just punch it through the cardboard, you drag it along the concrete. I'm cringing a little bit inside just thinking about it, but this could do it 100%. And you know what? I could sharpen the tip back up, no freaking problem. And, you know, it would add a little bit of wabi-sabi wear to it. I mean, sure, okay, why not? And, you know, spa services are a thing. You can maybe get replacement blades if you really, really mess it up, although you probably wouldn't do it that bad. But the thing is, maybe you'd really rather not. I mean, for me at least, with a task like that, an hour of resharpening the tip is not something I necessarily want to be spending my time doing. And similarly, for a loaner knife, like this guy, I don't actually own this knife. This is going to be going to a buddy of mine. I literally could not put this down on the floor and start beating on it, because then I'd be hurting somebody else's knife. I can't pull that off. So that's one situation. It's just really abusive cutting tasks. Or maybe you get a coworker who walks up to you and says, hey, Nick, can I borrow your knife for a few minutes? This is a dangerous thing, because although at some level there are people I would absolutely trust, no problem, but other people are going to use the knife for things like prying or scraping or dropping. This is every knife person I think has felt this need, like, oh, what are you using it for there, buddy? Because there's a danger there, and there are things that a knife person wouldn't do to a knife that somebody who doesn't, you know, really give a damn absolutely would. Or the other thing is, maybe you're just carrying a knife that isn't well suited to the task. I mean, something like this knife, let's face it, is not going to be well suited to a lot of cutting tasks. Let's be real. I mean, look at how quickly this balloons out to full thickness. There are tasks this knife will not work for. Or maybe you've got something that is super, super, super slicey, but a little bit fragile as a result, so it's not suited to a really high-stress cut. Or maybe a slip joint knife that, frankly, won't work for some varieties of cutting, or it won't be the safe choice. And so, in all of those cases, if you've got an abusive cutting task, if you're lending it to somebody, or you're carrying something that's a little too fancy for function, you're going to find yourself wanting something that, well, is the right tool for the job. And that's when a lot of folks turn to the idea of a backup beater sort of knife. Sometimes this is just like a budget knife that you're not worried about. You keep this guy in your backpack. You keep it in your other pocket. You keep it someplace. And then if somebody says, hey, Nick, can I borrow your knife? Yeah, sure thing. Here you go. It's going to be safe. It'll work well for them. The Rat 2 here is a great choice for this. It's $32. It's a perfectly safe tool. It will work for any task, but you're not going to cry too hard if you accidentally injure it there. For me personally, I actually tend to use the knife on my Leatherman, my multi-tool here, as a backup beater knife. Because look, it's already a little bit beat up. I can resharpen it pretty straightforwardly and whatnot, and I'm not going to mourn too badly. Heck, I could probably even get it replaced if there's a big problem here. So that's one option. But another option is actually to use these kinds of things here. These are folding utility sorts of knives. Now, I know what you're thinking. Well, Nick, there are lots of utility knives out there. Why'd you do one of these kinds of things? Well, I mean, in a lot of ways, these offer some pretty compelling options, namely in that they're relatively small. I mean, a full-size utility knife, which I don't have on the table because I am #not a brilliant man, but they tend to be big. They tend to be more the size of this guy, and so carrying one around is, well, a little bit more of a commitment. And so unless you plan to do a lot of utility cutting, they're not great. But these things you can stash in a pocket. You can stash in your tool belt or something like that. You can put one of these guys in your pack. You can put one in a drawer. I mean, these are very easy to just distribute around here. Mind you, these are not going to be great choices for everyday carry knives. That's why I would call this a backup kind of thing. I mean, for instance, this has just terrible ergonomics because your fingers are going to be gripping onto these sharp corners here and a relatively sharp edge. That's just not great, and there are just hot spots all over the freaking place for this guy. And so that's a reason why I might want to carry something that's a little bit better if I have the choice. You also don't get a very good one-handed experience with these guys because, well, honestly, I mean, take a look at this thing. This is not great in terms of backlocking. I mean, you can pop it open there one-handed, which is fine. Backlocking it one-handed, maybe like this? I mean, it's not a one-handy sort of thing. That's not a great thing. 100%. You have a very low depth of cut. I mean, with any of these guys, there is only so far that this blade sticks out. And so if you're trying to make a cut that's deeper than this into a material, you're out of luck, as opposed to, you know, on something like this, where you can get a much, much deeper cut. So that's an important thing. And they're weirdly shaped in the pocket. And honestly, for me at least, the biggest thing carrying this guy is just that it feels so badly made. I mean, it's scratchy. That's ugly. There is zero feeling of mastery. There's zero feeling of aesthetic beauty. It's cheaply made crap. But the thing is, the blades are quite literally disposable. On something like this has a separate little backlock for the blade here. You can pull the blade out at the end of the day, and if you've beaten the crap out of it, you can literally throw that blade away. Or if you beat the crap out of one side, you flip it around, you put it in the other way, case closed, problem solved. These also tend to be relatively cheap. This is like $12. In fact, I think all of these, well, actually, this guy's pricier, but still, they tend to be relatively inexpensive, and they tend to be pretty safe. Because, okay, look, even if the lock fails, as I'm cutting with it, and it's a backlock, so it's less likely to fail anyways. Even if that fails, there's not really any problem with it because the part that has the blade is still in control. As opposed to really crappy knives, like if I were to pick up like an M-Tech or a Z-Hunter or something like that, this is just unsafe, period. Whereas this is going to be reasonably safe as a default. Anyways, so there were a lot of good things, and there were a lot of nice options in this realm here. I mean, I've talked about the Gerber Eablete. I guess they call it the EAB Lite. It's the Eablete. Let's just be real here. But there are other options, too. You get knives like this little guy here. This is by Husky Knives, and I suspect that these three are all being made by the same factory in China someplace. But look, I mean, this works, and you have the nice advantage. You pull this back to pull out the blade here. Or, I'm sorry, you pull this back to pull this down and replace the blade. They're easy, it's small, it carries safely, etc. You've got this Sheffield number here, or you've got a Craftsman-branded version of the same damn thing. Again, same basic idea here, but they're just doing the same idea. You get other options, even like your minimalist options, like this little guy. This is the original of these was the Rexford RUT, or Rut, I guess. This is another version. It's sort of inspired by the Rut, certainly. It's the Big Eye design titanium pocket tool. The thing is, this guy, although it's nice because it's very, very small and it's very, very lightweight, and so you can just throw this guy in a pocket or something like that, and you have this blade. You have even lower depth of cut than usual, because it gets real janky when you get out to this level here, and it's very expensive. This guy right here is $70, and the Rexford Rut is $150. And honestly, if you're paying $150 for your backup beater blade, that's not something I'm super in love with. I'm not sure that makes that much sense. And of course, there's always just buying a boring run-of-the-mill utility blade and throwing it in your pack or something, handing it to people like that. Everyone knows how to use one of those, so it's nice and easy. Thing is, all of these things will nicely serve to fill that niche role, and they'll do so pretty inexpensively, which is a beautiful, beautiful thing. Now, okay, of course, there are going to be people who will argue loudly and very proudly in the comments below that this is a stupid concept, that you should never need a backup beater. You should never buy a knife that you are not willing to beat on. This is usually accompanied by grumbling about expensive toys, fancy-ass man jewelry, beards, etc. There's a whole thing there. But the thing is, it is a fair perspective, and I nearly agree. Because if you buy something that you would never use to cut anything with, well, that's kind of defeating the purpose a little bit. At that point, you have bought art rather than a knife, and that's fine, and you're welcome to do so. I have no objection to people who want to buy beautiful objects, but you're doing something fundamentally different than buying a knife. That's a thing. And similarly, if a knife is so fragile that even if the chips are down, you couldn't use it to do serious cutting. Even if you're in a situation where you don't have something like this, but you absolutely do need to do some abusive cutting and it would just fail, well, then that's a problem. And there were definitely knives out there that I've reviewed that made me feel like I needed a backup knife, either because they wouldn't cut or because they were a little too fragile or something like that. And that's pretty telling, and honestly, it's enough to kick a knife out of my pocket. If I can't trust the knife at that very basic level to hold up to some harder use if I need it to, I'm not necessarily going to want to hold on to it there. But look, so that there is a valid point. If you need a backup beater, that means there's something maybe a little wonky with your choice in knife. And it's also the case that for many, it's not really a concern. For me personally, this isn't something I've thought about all that much, because my cutting tasks at work and at home tend to focus more on things like sharpness and sliciness, even than on a harder use sort of cutting. I'm not cutting, cardboard on a warehouse floor or something like that. I mean, very, very rarely do I have a task where I even need to think twice about something, even if I'm carrying something great. I mean, this is a perfectly functional knife in my everyday life because, well, most of the time I'm opening boxes, I'm cutting through foam, etc. And so, yeah. And I also don't mind using my knives, getting a little bit of wear on them, even on the fancier pieces. If I'm not using it, I'm not enjoying it. What's the freaking point there? Worst case, I can resharpen, I can get things touched up, etc. And if somebody wants to borrow my knife, usually I'll either go with them, like, oh, yeah, sure, I'll help you out here, or I hand them the Leatherman, which works just as well, and they're unlikely to break. But either way, this is something you do want to think about, certainly, particularly if you have fancier tastes. If you buy knives that tend to be a little bit more artistic, or if you have needy coworkers or a concrete floor worth of cardboard boxes that aren't going to break themselves down, then having a knife around that is a backup beater, whether it's a nice budget blade that you can, hand around, or something like this with disposable blades, a utility knife, anything like that, can absolutely save you and your collection a lot of pain. So let me know in the comments, do you carry a backup beater? What do you use? What's your preference there? And is this whole thing entirely freaking crazy? I'm sure I'll get plenty of that anyways. Anyways, I hope this has been an interesting little discussion here, and have yourselves just an absolutely wonderful and reasonably light use rest of your day. Bye now.